Hello and welcome to Partnering for Change, the enabling role of financial and related professional services. My name is Miles Celic, I'm the Chief Executive of the City UK, and it's my privilege to host and moderate today's discussion, which comes against the backdrop of COP26 and an incredibly important time looking at the role of this industry in supporting the transition to net zero internationally. For those of you who will be familiar with City UK, you'll know that it is the representative body for the financial and related professional services industry here in the UK, representing 10% of UK economic activity, paying 13% of the UK's taxes, and responsible for 1 in 14 of the jobs in the UK economy, of which 2/3 are based outside the M25. And green and sustainable finance has been a rising issue for the members and the companies that the City UK represents. It has risen in salience and risen in urgency as the months and the years have gone by, and that's come to crystallisation point here at COP26 at the City UK. We run a green and sustainable finance group that looks at these issues, led by Anne-Marie Verstraeten, the country head of BNP Paribas. But today we will be looking at the role of financial and related professional services as a supporter for the wider economy, providing transition finance support for the move to net zero that is going to be critical for the battle against climate change and the adaptation that the global economy is going to have to go through in the years ahead. And I'm very fortunate to be joined today by 6 people who can go through 3 examples of concrete specificity around the contribution that financial and related professional services has made to that transition challenge. So it's a great pleasure to be joined here in the studio by Marisa Drew, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Credit Suisse, who is responsible for directing, coordinating and facilitating activities which support sustainable finance. And to my right, we are also joined by Sean Kidney, the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, which develops standards, taxonomies, advocates for policy and promotes the rapid creation of investable green assets. And Marisa and Sean will be talking about the recent cooperation between Credit Suisse and the Climate Bonds Initiative. Joining us virtually, we have Jarek Olszowska, the head of sustainable finance at Nomura International, who focuses on the origination, structuring and execution of ESG fixed income products around the globe. And Jarek is joined by Dr. Sherif Ayoub, the Chief Financial Officer of the Arab Petroleum Investments Corporation. Dr. Ayoub oversees treasury and capital markets, financial control, planning and analytics, and corporate for performance and risk management. And Jarek and Sherif will be talking us through Apicorp's inaugural ESG bond transaction. And finally, we're joined by Jubilee Easo, partner in the Global Energy Group at Eversheds Sutherland. Her practice is focused on the hydrogen, gas and LNG sectors, having advised international energy companies, state entities and financial institutions on a wide range of energy transition, gas and project developments. And joining her is Mark Warren-Fuentes, who heads the legal team for Equinor's renewables division in the North Sea region and has more than 10 years experience in the development and financing of clean technology. Jubilee and Mark will be talking to us about Eversheds Sutherland's partnership with Equinor, all of which are areas that I think will be of great interest to everybody joining us this afternoon. But I'd like to kick off with Marisa and Sean first. Marisa, over to you.
Well, this all started because I'm a 30-year plus career investment banker. Most of my career was in the capital markets. And one of the observations that I had is that there was a very big gap in the market when we were coming on to the discussion of transition finance. So there is a very well-trodden green bond market, as we all know, which is now over $1 trillion in new issue volumes. But for those high carbon emitting companies, these are clients of ours, they were bemoaning the fact that they really didn't have access to the green bond market. They were told because of their activities that wasn't available to them, and yet they needed the capital to fund the transition. And one of the roles as a financial institution that we bring is that we believe we should be able to mobilize capital at scale. So on the one hand, we had issuers saying they wanted the opportunity. On the other hand, we had investors saying they want to invest behind the green transition. And then the third constituents in the triangle were the regulators coming to banks saying, we want you to accelerate the financing of the transition. So there was this big gap in the market. And from my observation, in order to have markets scale, you need to have some set of standards to give the market confidence so that it really understands with rigor what a credible transition looks like, because that's the real key here is how does one define a credible transition? So when we decided to embark on trying to answer that question, we thought there was no better partner, and SDG 17 is partnerships, than to work with the Climate Bond Initiative, who were some of the architects of the early green bond principles and a very, very credible nonprofit. So they didn't have any skin in the game in terms of a bias, to partner to say, could we define that in some very, very rigorous way? So I'll let Sean maybe comment on the partnership a little bit and how that evolved, and it's been a great journey, I think, together.
Look, it has been a great journey together. You know, we need to drive transitions. We need more solar, we need more railways, but we also need to make steel companies make sure they actually change to become zero or low carbon steel companies, and so on and so on. That hasn't been happening. That in terms of the green finance market, it has been, as Marisa says, a gap. We want to do the work on how you define what are adequately ambitious strategies. Like, not all improvements are good, because if you don't do enough of an ambitious improvement, you block the chance to do a good improvement. So adequate ambition, and try to come up with all the data points we need to assess whether an entity's promises are good enough. You know, this will be useful grist for the sustainable loan market, sustainable bond market, and so on. You know, are the oil company 2050 commitments adequately ambitious? What's the framework for making that decision? And we also needed a partner who would be able to advise us on the practicability about it. And that, you know, the truth is, it's all very well coming up with an idea in a dark room. Unless you actually road test it with someone who is committed to making it work, you're not going to get it right. And that's what we've done. We came up with a paper we jointly published called Financing Credible Transitions, which has been, I have to say, extraordinarily influential in the market because of the partnership. And now we have the beginning of a global discourse on transitions. We have ASEAN, China, Japan, Colombia, Chile, all talking about transition. And it flows from that intellectual work we did together.
Fantastic. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that shortly, but I'd like to move on to Jarek and Sherif. Obviously, this is a problem and a challenge that exists globally, and it's important that we look at this beyond just some of the usual developed markets, but to also think about what's happening, particularly in places such as the Middle East. So I think that's what makes this especially exciting as an example. So Jarek, perhaps over to you first.
Yeah, sure. So during our panel together with Dr. Sherif, we wanted to present Apicorp's inaugural ESG bond transaction, which has been executed with Nomura's help just a couple of weeks ago. And to us, it's an example of a partnership that's crucial to delivering leading international investors, ESG-driven investors, to a region which is key in reaching Paris Agreement goals. So just by way of background, it was a 750 million green bond transaction, and it was Apicorp's inaugural green bond. But the importance of the transaction is much more, I would say, far-reaching, that it has helped set the path for other energy-focused entities and financial institutions across the whole of Middle East and North Africa region. It's the first energy entity from the region to issue a green bond. And to us, it's a benchmark of how things should be done to effect transition, and sets a great precedent for the whole region. We're hearing of already news from, and Dr. Sherif can talk in more detail of others who are willing to follow in the footsteps of Apicorp's trailblazing transaction. And I would say it was a true litmus test for us whether international investor community would be willing to venture beyond the traditional borders. We're all aware how in Europe and increasingly in Asia, North America, there's a very deep green ecosystem to support sustainability. But in MENA, I would say it's at an earlier stage. And so we wanted to see whether there is willingness to support both Apicorp and also Dr. Sherif can outline a bit more on the roots and shareholding structure, the major economies in the region. So maybe I'll pass over to Dr. Sherif.
Thank you for having me, Miles. Indeed, so I think we've been consistently saying here in Apicorp, and Apicorp is a multilateral development bank owned by 10 member countries in the MENA region who are essentially oil exporters. So one thing that we've always been consistently saying is that the Paris Climate Accord and the net zero requirement targets will most likely not be achieved without this region. So I think it's very important that, yes, as you mentioned, Miles, to go perhaps a bit beyond the traditional borders in areas that are actually quite developed in the green space. Notably, obviously, Europe is very advanced. And then also the US and Asia right now is moving that direction as well. So in that respect, I think there has been some very good signals that have been coming from the MENA region, and we are engaged in policy dialogue with all of our 10 member countries to move them in that particular direction. We have a watershed moment that has happened this year with the ESG policy framework that's been approved by the member countries, and that was huge because it was the first institutionalization and move in that particular field beyond the rhetoric. And then we've seen, obviously, some statements and some targets that have been communicated by the UAE, for example, and lately by Saudi Arabia, and we expect others to follow suit. So in that respect, I think the movement is happening, and I think it is taking shape and perhaps moving at a speed, especially as of late, in a speed that is more encompassing of the need to be perhaps a bit more structured in how we approach this global phenomenon of global warming. So next along the line, I think in terms of what is the role of Apicorp as all other MDBs, whether it's the World Bank or the IFC or others, were expected to lead. It just so happens that Apicorp is in a sector that it is the story of and the issue of this generation, this year, and maybe even future generations as well. So in that respect, like I said, we're engaged with our member countries. We're looking at ways that we can formalize this structure, integrating ESG in terms of in the national policy making, but then also the national oil companies or NOCs in this region. And we have seen, obviously, there has been a statement that has been done or announcement that is public now with Qatar Energy that's examining going into the green space. There has been previous statements with PIF here in Saudi, as well as the debt management office for the Sutherland in Saudi as well. The statement that we would like to continue to engage with them is that it's investing in green is not a charity. There is economic sense. We apply all of our financing through a ROIC methodology, risk-adjusted return. We don't give any green financing any additional points. We wanted to compete with the traditional thing we do, but it's just doing just fine. High ROAs, high ROEs that are achieved by it. And insofar as Jarek mentioned that we link it to the liability side of the balance sheet of Apicorp through a green bond issuance, which we have done, and it was immensely successful. 62% were unique ESG investors that came in. 93% were outside from the MENA region, 3 times oversubscribed, the lowest benchmark spread in the history of Apicorp. Then the story starts making economic sense, the virtuous cycle that we all about, which is, you have these investments generating higher returns, and you have a bit of a greening on the liability side as well. So I think I'll just one comment as well, because I mentioned in terms of venturing, and I think, Marisa, you mentioned the credible transition, particularly in outside of developed markets. I think one thing that I found to be actually quite interesting in our green bond journey is that a lot of investors around the world are interested in the journey itself. So there is an understanding in emerging markets that it may not be as perfect of a story as something that would come out of, for example, out of Europe in this case. But I think a lot of people are adjusting their investment criteria to be a bit more aligned with the journey moving on to more energy transition and net zero requirements. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Ayoub. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that fascinating case study as we go on with this panel. But I'd like to move to our third case study. And Jubilee, perhaps you'd like to kick us off.
Great. Thanks a lot, Miles. What Mark and I are going to talk about is the role that legal advisors can play in achieving the energy transition by 2050, and how the partnership between an energy company and their external legal team can accelerate and support the transition. But maybe before we jump into that, Mark, as we all know, setting a net zero target for a company such as Equinor is only the first step in this whole journey. The next and probably the most difficult thing is the implementation, the monitoring and reporting of all of the work that needs to be done. Can you maybe provide us with a brief description of how Equinor has set its targets and what its plan is for GHG emissions?
Yeah, thanks, Jubilee. So Equinor, as a traditional oil and gas major, obviously has a long way to go in the energy transition. But we do have strong ambitions, and our objective is to reach net zero by 2050. And this is a huge challenge given our starting point. By way of example, our scope 1 and 2 emissions last year from upstream or midstream production were 13.5 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent, whereas our scope 3 emissions from end consumer use, supply chain, some 250 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So clearly we're not going to reach net zero alone, and we need support from our partners as well as government. Now, our strategy broadly is to transition from an oil and gas major to a broad, low carbon energy company focused on creating shared value by reducing emissions from our own oil and gas production and accelerating growth within renewables. In renewables, for example, we've already invested over $4 billion in our renewables business. We have a strong pipeline focusing on offshore wind clusters in the UK, the US, and the Baltics. We're a market leader in floating offshore wind farms. For example, one novel project we're developing is Hywind Tampen, which is a floating offshore wind farm that will directly supply power to 2 of our offshore oil in Norway. And overall, by 2020, we increase our renewable installed capacity between 12 to 16 gigawatts in equity share. We're also active in developing hydrogen and carbon capture and storage projects. Now, while renewables projects present their own multi-jurisdictional challenges, hydrogen and CCS present entirely new problems for us, because you're not only developing novel technology at scale with project-on-project risk, but you're doing so in a regulatory landscape. You're sharing risk with partners who are also going through their own transitions, bringing on board private and maybe public finance, all while simultaneously having to create the market for these products at the same time as producing them. So these are not easy targets to achieve. Time frame is tight, and the regulatory and contractual frameworks aren't always in place to facilitate the speed with which we need to act.
And I think this is where we as the legal advisors come into the picture. What we found in our discussions with you was that the first step in us making sure that we were available to help you and able to help you is the fact that we needed to build that expertise and bench strength within us and to be prepared for the energy transition ambitions ourselves. And the next thing was that you needed us to actually bring in experts from all the different sectors, for example, transport, energy, land use, environment, into the picture in order to be able to provide you with that multi-jurisdictional and multi-sector support that you needed. For example, you've talked about hydrogen and CCS. And what we needed to do for that is, in addition to what I've already mentioned in terms of expertise, but also bring in the expertise for offshore wind, gas, pipeline transportation, to be able to come up with the solutions, the contractual and commercial solutions that you needed to in order to put that contractual framework in place. Now, it's funny because what we need to do is to come up with novel solutions for what are very challenging issues, but also create that sort of standardized setup for you so that you can then implement it in future projects and also not have legal act as a bottleneck for the finalization of the large number of projects that you need to finalize in order to achieve that net zero target. So maybe you can also talk about how that partnership with us and other law firms works.
Sure. So first and foremost, it's really being about a trusted advisor. It's willing to invest in the long term to support us along the journey, which means really taking the time to understand our business model, our organization, our key value drivers, and also those of our partners and competitors. It can mean a lot of hand-holding at times, recognizing that ours is a large and complex organization with multiple decision makers and stakeholders who all need to go on this transition journey together. And it means training and experience transfer on a day-to-day basis. But it's also recognizing, I think, that the old model of specialist advisors for specific topics is becoming outdated. What we need is for our advisors to have that multi-jurisdictional, multi-industry experience, because where we're seeing the value and where we're seeing the opportunities to make big strides is in coordination between projects like common grid connections or sharing of development or operation solutions between developers. It's hybrid projects like co-located battery storage, green hydrogen, where offshore wind farms power onshore electrolyzers that produce hydrogen that's sold on to local industry, or blue hydrogen, where CCGT gas turbines produce hydrogen and the carbon's captured and stored in underground basins offshore. So what we need is for our advisors to be on top of and influence the regulatory framework that supports these projects. We need our advisors to be proactive in developing creative solutions, bringing best practice from a range of industries and markets, like you say. And importantly, we need to know that our advisors share our values and are really buying into that same journey going on.
Thanks, Mark. I'll hand over to Miles, and maybe we can talk about some of the other issues later.
Jubilee and Mark, thanks very much
Miles.
for that. That's been absolutely fascinating hearing that, and I'm sure this will come out in the discussions that we'll be having now. And I'd just like to kick off, Marisa and Sean. I mean, I thought it was a very compelling example of partnership, of coming together, that you've both brought something specific to that relationship.
It is compelling. It's
which,
fantastic.
of course, it is. Best, exactly what we want to kick off the discussion. So my sort of question is, therefore, what was the problem? When you looked at the problem you were solving for, how did you solve for that problem? What was it that you both brought to that? Perhaps, Marisa, if you'd like to kick off.
Well, the problem was fundamentally the gap. So you had this need of the issuer community, you had the need of the investment community, and you had this desire of the regulators, but yet there was nothing filling that gap. And to me, my observation was, how do you create the comfort for the market to stand behind financing these companies without the risk, the ever-present risk of greenwashing? So what was going on in the absence of a common set of definitions? You had self-labeled issuances. So everybody was calling something else transition or yellow or pink bond. But if you are an investor, first of all, most investors don't have huge resources at their disposal to look at every single issuance with the depth that is needed to understand what that label means. So there needs to be some sort of an easy methodology to enter the market and common definition. But also, they need to place confidence in the fact that credible really means that there's substance behind it. And I know Sean will talk a lot about that because he's very, very focused on what credible means. But so it's common definition, common taxonomy. It is adopted market standard. So one of the things that we did, and we were very deliberate about this, we didn't want this to be a Credit Suisse thing or a CBI thing. We wanted this to be a market thing. So when we went out, we said, okay, we'll help support the research, but we want to go out and solicit input from all sorts of actors, from climate scientists to academics to our partners in the industry and so on. We also were very fortunate to get endorsement from Mark Carney when he was governor of the Bank of England, and Mike Bloomberg lent us credibility, which gave more confidence. And then all of a sudden now you start to see something that that becomes that adopted standard. But maybe you want to talk, Sean, a little bit about this definition of credible transition, because greenwashing is a fear. Regulators are now getting more and more, I think, sophisticated in terms of scrutinizing what people say and do. And we wanted to make sure that we were helping ourselves as an industry rather than necessarily having it be imposed on us. Let us take control of our own destiny in some respects.
And I think that's a really important point. So as well as the point that I've just made to Marisa, you know, from your point of view, there's still a lot of cynicism out there about greenwashing. How best do we address that?
Look, we're doing something that we have never done before, as a society, as an economy, as a planet, which are trying to shift our energy systems and our economic systems on a dime. According to the IPCC, we're going to cut global emissions on average by 55% in the next 8 years. This is World War II, folks. That's how serious it is. To understand what we've got to do is challenging. It requires a real bridge between the science, which is often full of greys and full of detail on contrasting views, and the markets who need binary, look, just tell me what I've got to do, kind of thing. And so making that bridge is what we did, really. Now, don't get me wrong. In the first stage, which is all we've done so far, we've identified key principles and parameters to go for, which has been incredibly influential. We are working on a stage 2, which is more detailed analysis of what the pathways look like and what it translates into steel, cement, and so on, and how do you assess the corporate strategies. We essentially want to be able to offer a stamp to a corporation. Yes, your ambition is adequately ambitious to address the challenge of the millennia, which is climate change, and we're going to watch you every year, but go for it, and we want to count your whole company, all your fixed income, of course, as green for the purposes of it. You may be a really brown company now of pollutions. What really counts is where you're going to go in the next few years. Adequate ambition is difficult to figure out, but that's what we're doing, and that's what we've actually made a really good start at, and that's what we've been by financial credible transitions. But that bridging between the science and finance is challenging, because scientists, well, for a start, they're not allowed to say something definitive half the time. And two is, there's an awful lot of grey and shade, which is designed for a different kind of skill set to what we're doing. And so, yeah. It's a translation device.
And the other thing I would probably say is this also has to be dynamic, because what is green today may not be green tomorrow.
Yeah, that's true,
and so
too.
I think we also have to allow ourselves, well, let's hold a very high bar for ourselves. Let's also be flexible that over time, because transition is the operative word, we are transitioning to something. So we also have to know that there's a finite amount of time for us allowing transitions to happen. And another place that we really wanted to make a statement was on the use of offsets. Is it possible? Or are you giving people a free pass to just continue their polluting activities? So these are the sorts of subjects that we'll get deeper and deeper in as I think the market begins to form a view, and we want to be reflective of that view back again, while also, again, keeping that high bar all the way along.
Science-based action, not pledges, no offsets. All these sort of things are the core part of the principles. And of course, fundamentally, it's about achieving 1.5 degree change, because that's actually where we've got to go now. And the IPCC report of this year has made it explicitly clear what we've got to do. So let's understand what the implications are for industries, and let's show what is a correct path for the oil and gas sector, for what Equinor is doing in the world and so on, who are doing fantastic work. But do investors understand enough about what is really in and what isn't in? And that's challenging.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect segue to go back to Jarek and Dr. Ayoub. I mean, we've already talked about the importance of the MENA region. In this, we've talked about the importance, as already come up on this discussion here, about the oil and gas industry. How optimistic are you that the path that you started trailblazing is going to be followed by others in the MENA region?
Jump in. I really enjoyed the.
Sorry, after you.
Yeah. So I enjoyed Sean's analogy to World War III, and I think with Dr. Sherif, we tried to open a new front in this battle, and I think while opening this front, and we've prepared the trenches very well. We've chosen very green assets in terms of type of categories. Apicorp pre-issuance published a very detailed ESG investment policy, which kind of goes to the whole balance sheet of the issuer. So they're not focusing on one snapshot that we've identified, some potential green assets, but it's kind of more transformational at an organizational level. And part of the preparation, I think, for was key was that we've organized a non-deal roadshow and deal roadshow where the Apicorp senior management met 100+ accounts. So extremely detailed investor work with accounts from Europe, North America, Japan, Asia, and I think we've seen how sophisticated these ESG investors are in the level of DD they do before committing. And so we didn't opt for yellow or pink, as Marisa was saying, or some other type. It's a very dark green issuance, which has been also confirmed by very robust second party opinions. And in terms of others to follow, I'll defer to Dr. Sherif, because he's very embedded what's going on in the region.
Thank you, Jarek, and 100%, Miles. I think the introduction and the topic that Marisa and Sean were talking about is actually extremely important. So I think the discussion is more on perhaps a regulatory of how the one is going to be structuring this, how you're going to fill the gap in terms of guidance to the industry, just to make sure it's on the right path. And just to capture the key word that Sean is talking about is action. So I think less pledges and more action, and this is perhaps where financial institutions such as ours come in. So. In that respect, the key message that, again, just to, at the risk of being repetitive, it is economically viable. It should be economically viable to be able to invest in green. You've seen, for example, the solar PVs, the cost of the solar PVs has immensely been reduced over the last few years. And, there's all this talk now about blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. And we don't think Apicorp think it's commercial yet. I think there's a lot of subsidies and a lot of support that governments can do, and a lot of perhaps government-owned entities can do to be able to support this. But I think we're going to get there. We have some of these technologies and to support the energy transition. So I think on the asset side, as I said before, it has to make sense, and it does make sense. And on the liability side, and so far that, and we're working with Nomura on this and reaching out to investors. And there is, I can confirm to you, there is agreement on the day that we came in, 29 September. The market was a little all over the place, and Jarek can back me up on this. I think Asia was facing difficulties. It was in the red, and then Europe as well. But when we open the books, if people ask me now, besides does issuing green add stability to the deal? Absolutely. And the book has built up over the day. Actually, it was a 2-day execution, and we stayed up no matter all these issues of there was the Evergrande issue. There was some noise in terms of inflation and so on and so forth. So I think in that respect, I think it makes sense for issuers to proceed in green. A lot of my colleagues in Apicorp has also mentioned in terms of we're seeing even the spreads in some of the green projects have been reducing, which is actually bad for a financial institution, but good for the borrower, which is actually quite good. In fact, we're seeing such a development and such a need and a desire to invest in green that we're seeing some prepayments that are being done as borrowers are capitalizing on this on green. So action is happening, Sean. We're just pushing it along, and we're hoping that more and more people join on. And quite confident and quite optimistic that will continue and the trajectory will continue going forward.
That's great.
One final thing, which is something that I feel strongly about. The energy transition that's happened reminds me of the IT transition that was happening in the early 90s. We knew that something big is going to happen. Nobody knew exactly what's going to happen, but knew something everybody thought something. And we've seen the developments and the giants that came out of this, whether it's Apple or Google and Yahoo at the time. So what I'm trying to say here is that we are going to be investing, and we are investing a lot in the energy transition, and we are looking for champions that will push that along. And if we in COP 27 and 28 and 29, you'll see much more emergence of new technologies that would push us along the space. So this is something that we are very optimistic on, and we hope that we can find people.
Yeah, great. I think that's a really encouraging sign of what may be coming. I'm conscious that we're running low on time, so I'm going to turn to Jubilee and Mark. I think, Mark, one of the points that you raised was the role here of legal services and moving away. I think your point was moving away from old models of specialisms. And the important thing here is that there is an ecosystem of financial and related professional services that can support this. What is your sense of the role of professional services, legal services in particular, in helping make that happen? Jubilee, perhaps you'd like to kick us off.
Yes, I think that we need to start thinking about legal services and how we partner with our clients as being a true partnership. What clients want is not us providing the expertise from these different sectors, but they want us to enable them, to provide them with the expertise for them to actually do this themselves, very often train them to create the expertise within them, and that's a true partnership. Very often, we just heard the example about energy transition being a lot like IT. The whole transition there, and what I like to think about is very often energy transition is also a bit like the issues that we've seen around D&I. Our clients want to make sure that their law firms have the same ideology as them, are thinking about the issues in the same way of them so that they can partner and unblock these issues. And we also have to keep in mind, maybe another point to make is the fact that, this is the point that Marisa made about today not necessarily being green tomorrow. Documents are actually very complex documents that we have to put together. Not every issue has the final solution or final regulatory framework right now. So we have to create robust documents that can work for our clients, not just today, but also as things keep moving. And this is where that true partnership actually comes across. Mark?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I was reminded of the analogy of, give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, but teach him how to fish and he'll, sustain himself for the rest of his life. And that's sort of how I see our relationship a bit with our developing relationship with our advisors. We don't want to be spoon-fed the answers every time. We really need to get that experience transfer so that we can push the development ourselves as much as possible and be as self-sufficient as possible. Obviously, these are extremely complex developments, extremely complex projects that we're doing throughout the globe. So there will always be a place for our legal advisors, our financial advisors, our technical advisors, to bring in their specific expertise to guide the process. But where we really see the value in our advisors is in going on that journey together, right? And working together to give ourselves the tools, give ourselves the capacity to be able to drive that transition forward. Because, like you say, we are in companies like Equinor, we are at the forefront of the energy transition. And if it's going to happen, it's going to happen through companies like ours. So we really do rely a lot on our advisors.
Great, thank you very much. We are, I'm afraid to say, almost out of time, which is hugely disappointing, because I think what this conversation has shown is just how much more there is that we could be discussing, and the experiences that people have had and the value of those experiences, and the sharing of best practice. It does feel like we are still in some ways in the foothills. There is a long way to go, but I think the progress so far has been hugely encouraging. So with that, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank our partners in the production of this panel, the City of London Corporation and the Green Finance Institute. I would like to thank our panellists for what has been a thought-provoking, fascinating discussion with a great deal of food for thought. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for this discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much.